Imagine being treated unfairly in a place where you should feel safe and comfortable. That's exactly what happened to one black woman on a flight when a flight attendant refused to apologize after a serious mistake. What started as a simple misunderstanding soon escalated into a shocking confrontation. The flight attendant, instead of de-escalating the situation, doubled down and refused to offer any form of apology. But just 5 minutes later, something happened that no one saw coming. The very same flight attendant found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. In this video, we'll dive into the story of how a refusal to take responsibility led to a sudden and unexpected turn of events. Stay tuned to find out what happened next, because sometimes things don't always go as planned, especially when pride gets in the way. The woman, a seasoned traveler, had experienced her fair share of delays and inconveniences, but nothing like this. She had boarded the flight with high hopes of a smooth trip, but things took a turn when she was assigned a seat that was clearly marked as unavailable. After asking the flight attendant for help, she was met with a cold response. The attendant brushed her off, insisting there was nothing wrong with the seating arrangement, despite the visible sign. When the woman asked again, a simple apology seemed like the least the attendant could offer. But instead, she was met with defensiveness and a refusal to acknowledge the mistake. The tension in the air grew as other passengers began to notice. Some were clearly uncomfortable, sensing the brewing conflict. But what nobody expected was the way the situation would unfold in just a few short moments. The woman's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the flight attendant's escalating attitude. But the real twist, it was coming. As the minutes ticked by, the woman's frustration grew, but she kept her composure, determined not to let the situation get out of hand. She knew she wasn't the only one noticing the flight attendant's attitude. A few nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing the escalating tension. One even leaned over and whispered, "You should report her." But the woman just nodded, unsure of what to do next. She didn't want to make a scene. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's defensive stance only seemed to make things worse. Rather than resolving the issue, her responses became increasingly sharp, as though she was more concerned about being seen as wrong than helping the passenger in front of her. At one point, she rolled her eyes, which made the woman's blood boil. She had always tried to stay calm in uncomfortable situations, but this felt different. This felt like disrespect. Then, just as the flight was about to reach cruising altitude, an unexpected announcement came over the intercom. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Something big was about to happen, but no one could have guessed what. Everyone's eyes shifted nervously, waiting for the next move in this dramatic standoff. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The woman, her patience now fraying, glanced around at the other passengers, wondering if anyone would speak up. But no one did. Instead, the flight attendant continued to ignore her, insisting there was nothing she could do. The silence that followed was deafening. Every word felt like it carried more weight than the last. Finally, the woman had enough. She took a deep breath, stood up, and approached the front of the cabin. As she reached the galley, the tension was at its peak. The flight attendant stood with her back to her, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything would fall apart. The woman was ready to demand an apology, but before she could speak, the intercom crackled again. This time, the captain's voice cut through the quiet, calling for an immediate crew meeting at the back of the plane. A few seconds later, the flight attendant's demeanor shifted. She turned, eyes wide, her face pale. Something was wrong. The crew member, who had been so dismissive moments ago, suddenly looked rattled, her confidence gone. The flight attendant's attention shifted back to the woman, but now it wasn't anger she saw in the woman's eyes. It was something much more unsettling. There was no way back now. As the flight attendant turned toward the woman, her eyes were wide with panic, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Is there something I can help you with now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman's pulse raced. She wasn't about to let the flight attendant off the hook. But before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. A different crew member, one who had been quietly observing the exchange from the back, approached them. He was calm but firm, his eyes scanning the woman's face before shifting to the flight attendant. "We need to talk," he said, his tone sharp enough to make even the most confident person hesitate. The woman, caught off guard, watched as the two flight attendants exchanged a brief, uneasy glance. It was clear that something was about to happen, but neither she nor anyone else could have predicted what came next. Suddenly, the woman was pulled aside, and the crew member who had stepped in began speaking in hushed tones. The flight attendant, visibly shaken, looked over her shoulder toward the cockpit door. It was then the woman realized something was terribly off. The entire atmosphere on the plane shifted. It felt as if the crew had been caught in a lie. The flight attendant's face drained of color as she took a step back, her hand trembling. The woman, now more confused than ever, was left with a haunting feeling. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was something much bigger, and she was about to be swept into it. As the mystery deepened, the rest of the passengers began to notice the change in energy, their whispers growing louder. What had started as a personal issue now felt like a much larger conspiracy, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. The woman's heart raced as she stood there, caught in the tension of the moment. The flight attendant and the crew member were still speaking quietly, but the words were just out of reach. Finally, the flight attendant took a deep breath, her face drained of all color. She turned to the woman, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. I made a mistake," she muttered, barely audible. "I was supposed to report something earlier. Something happened in the cockpit." The woman's mind raced as the reality began to set in. This wasn't just about a seating mix-up. The flight attendant's refusal to apologize had been a cover-up. Before the woman could respond, the crew member gestured for them both to step aside. "The captain needs to speak with you," he said, his voice tight. They moved quickly toward the back of the plane, where the atmosphere felt colder. The crew member pulled the woman aside, telling her in hushed tones that there had been a security breach earlier during boarding. The flight attendant had inadvertently become involved, and rather than reporting it, she had tried to cover her tracks. The entire situation was far more serious than anyone had realized. But just when the woman thought things couldn't get worse, the unexpected twist hit. The captain, who had been silent throughout, emerged from the cockpit and walked toward them. As he did, he dropped a bombshell. The flight attendant wasn't just a crew member. She had been under investigation for months due to previous complaints. The woman's ordeal was just the tip of the iceberg. The airline had been tracking her behavior, waiting for a mistake, and this incident had sealed her fate. The tension in the cabin was unbearable as the woman processed the shocking turn of events. The flight attendant, now visibly panicked, was escorted off the plane by security, her resignation in hand. As the woman settled back into her seat, she realized just how close she had come to something far darker than a mere seating error. The entire flight had been part of a larger, hidden drama that no one could have anticipated. As the flight continued, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly avoided a much bigger situation. The plane's atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but the weight of what had just unfolded stayed with her. The crew member who had intervened offered her a reassuring smile before walking away, as if to say that justice had been served. For the woman, though, this experience had been a stark reminder of the hidden battles we often don't see. The flight attendant's refusal to apologize had set off a chain of events that revealed far more than anyone expected. By the time the plane touched down, the woman felt a sense of relief. Relief not just from the tension, but from knowing that standing up for what's right can lead to change, even when it feels like the odds are against you. The events would linger in her mind, but they also left her with a new sense of strength and awareness.